and we're live. Not really, but
Welcome to the Darnell and Cody show. We are starting a podcast to discuss issues that are current and stuff that people are constantly thinking about. We'll be getting into many subjects over the next few weeks and hopefully years. And tonight we're going to be starting off with our first discussion ever about immigration and the border wall that Trump has made so famous or infamous. And I'm going to first start talking about whether immigration is actually a problem. First, we should probably delve into the economical aspects of immigration, which first I have to state that me and both Darnell aren't experts on, but we are pretty informed on the basics of the subject, and we are going to do our best to cover everything that we can. So I personally think that as far as I've read and have researched on this subject, which I've done a bit before starting this podcast, that the economic bad side of things tends to go both ways with good and bad. There tend to be benefits and drawbacks to immigration with this. Some of the good things are people who are constantly willing to do jobs that are on demand. And the best thing about immigration is actually being able to import people who are skilled workers for jobs that are on demand. And that's a very important part of our society. We import doctors and engineers and different kinds of computer workers from all over the world to help us where our schools are failing us right now. You have anything to add on that, Darnell?
well, first of all, I would like to point out that it's very important that both sides, like you said, have good and bad, pros and cons. And it's important that no matter what side of the issue you're on, you acknowledge those uh, good and bad points. So it's not really about I'm on the left, I'm on the right about defense. It's really about I'm on the left side, I admit these problems on my side. Let's talk about these problems. I'm on the right side, and I admit that I have these certain problems that I'm going to talk about. So we have to acknowledge both sides' faults before we make any meaningful progress. So on the economic side, I would have to say yes, there are some uh, definitive benefits to having immigration, skilled workers coming into the country and offering them jobs that are available. But we also have to take that with a certain amount of caveats and say there are people in this country without jobs, there are people in this country that need support. When do we draw a line and say Americans first, foreigners second? To say, and this sounds a bit harsh. We are a nation of immigrants, and I understand I won't concede all those points, but from a practical standpoint, we still have homelessness in this country. We still have impoverished persons in this country. When do we draw a line and say we're not the charity organization for the world? We have to take care of our own, and then once we fix everything in America, and we really do have no one starving here, no one in need here, then we can focus on other countries and help them out of compassion and generosity. But until then, I'm skeptical of just blindly being compassionate in the ways. This blind compassion is turning a blind eye towards the people that we need to take care of first. It's like if my mother or my son and children are starving, I shouldn't be focusing on my neighbor's starving child and starving mother or whatever this case may be. It may sound heartless in a way, but it's a matter of practicality, in my view.
I agree. I especially agree with your point that you first stated. We need to look at both sides and acknowledge the faults on both sides. That's really how we're going to come to solutions here. And I totally agree. I mean, America, we've kind of made this assumption where we are like the police of the world in a way, and we have this duty to help everyone. But as you've clearly stated, and it's an undeniable fact, there are people in America who are struggling, and America is not doing them the justice that it is doing other people right now that are from other lands. So I totally agree. We need to help our own before we can look at others. We should make ourselves the paradise that people want to come to before welcoming other people into our paradise. So that's a great point. I think that kind of ties into our next topic. We're not that experts on the economy. We may touch on that again throughout the discussion here, but we're going to go to the next one, which is a cultural standpoint. And this has really damaged certain areas in Europe, specifically Germany and Sweden, where certain countries have basically opened their borders to different kinds of immigrants that are not um, blending well with their society, for a lack of a better term. These people come from a completely different side of the planet. They don't believe the same things that the Germans do. They don't have the same kind of human respect for people, and especially women. They're running into a lot of issues with, people grabbing physically women, mistreating them, etc. These people also are struggling finding jobs that they're able to keep for long periods of time, and it's just a real problem that people don't want to acknowledge on the left, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's always I don't want to say interesting, but it's always a valid point where you have criminals essentially coming into the country, whatever country it may be, under the guise of being a refugee, and then ironically becoming criminals themselves that the natural locals want to seek refugee from. And of course, you can't put a blanket statement or a blanket over all immigrants or all refugees, I should say, and say, oh, they're all criminals. Of course, you don't want to do that. But there's something to be said. In particular, I want to mention it's not just Germany, it's also like Sweden and uh, in England and France. And you
All
can
over
name,
Europe,
right,
yes.
all over Europe, essentially. And it's just, there's something to be said about that, yes, when you bring impoverished, uneducated people from war torn or otherwise impoverished conditions, they're not gonna be the same as someone that's raised in a first world country. It's just not the way it's not gonna be seamless, at least, right? And I'm not saying that people from the first world have a higher moral character or anything like that. All I'm saying is that the environment does shape how you behave. And if you're raised and born around, rape and violence and murder and all this, uh, senselessness, essentially, then this is how you're gonna behave no matter where you are. And so we have to take that under consideration when we accept these refugees in. This isn't to say that we shouldn't accept refugees. It's more so how do we do this in a better way? How do we mitigate these dangers of accepting, unfortunately, people that I don't want to say are barbarians, but for lack of a better word, uncultured almost, right? At least uncultured in the eyes of the Western standards of ethics. Um,
Yes.
so then, what do we
I
do,
see.
right?
I
What's the
see a
solution here?
solution. I see a solution in the what Canada has done, and Canada is very keen on limiting the number of people that they allow in for this very reason, because they have realized, and I feel like honestly this is the best solution that I know of, that they have groups of families who volunteer. It's like 7 or 8 families combined together in order to raise one family into Canadian society. All these people work together to show them, how to withdraw money from the bank, how to shop, but not only all of these kind of things that we deem frivolous, but also how to interact with human beings and treat each other. Canadians are some of the nicest people in the world, and they transfer that over to their immigrants in this way by raising them in these family dynamics. The European countries don't practice this method. Especially in Germany, they welcome people in. They basically live in 10 cities, and they're expected to just get government aid that they receive from Germany, or it's even in Sweden, this is happening. And then they're just expected to find a job and fare for themselves, basically, in this country of people. They interact with people without any real guidance from the actual people who live there. And America doesn't do this either. We don't do the Canadian model. So, the Democrat solution of just welcoming everybody in and assuming they're going to assimilate with us is false. Then the Republicans don't have a solution either for this. And no one's talking about the Canadian thing. So I think that's something to look at that really could help everybody in the planet out. But beyond that, I really don't see a solution. And again, it's got to be limited numbers. You can't just welcome everybody. It's just not feasible, unfortunately, for some people.
Right, right. We're not trying to have like an exodus of entire populations coming to another population, right? It's just never worked out historically. But I'm curious about this Canadian policy. Is it a policy like this formed by the government, or is it just something that Canadians do naturally?
Well, it's kind of helped out by people just, naturally, but the Canadian government does kind of fund it, and they're the ones who limit the amount of people who can actually come into the not the United States, the Canadian provinces.
Right. So,
So
they have this program of assimilation where
they have volunteers that are Canadians, and based on the numbers of volunteers, they allow a certain number of people that are considered refugees to come into their country.
right.
And it's so they very limiting on what they're able to do based on the number of volunteer families they have.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So you need more than just saying welcome to Sweden, welcome to America, welcome to Canada. Good luck. Here's some money, and that can't be the solution to the refugee crisis, right? That can't be the answer. So if you wanna fix these these problems we have, like you said, there has to be something more human, more personal, more interactive than just here's some money, here's a house, assimilate somehow, right?
Yeah, it clearly is not working in Germany and Sweden, and I don't think it's working that well in America, or at least as much as we would like it to be.
Right, and I think that leads us to our next topic, which is the what is it?
We're going to talk about the numbers of the immigrants that are actually coming into the United States here.
Right, right.
And again, we're not blanket saying every single person from South America and Central America and from Mexico can't assimilate with our culture. Some of those people will be fine at it. Some won't be, unfortunately, and that's just something that we have to acknowledge. So on to the numbers of immigrants that are actually coming into America. This is something that I really don't see a lot of people talking about, unfortunately. And it's something that's interested me for quite some time, especially because of people's raising hysteria on this issue. And I've basically been researching this. It seems to me that since about 2000 and 2003-ish time frame, the decline of people trying to basically sneak their way into America was taking place, and it got to the point where there was enough people actually leaving the country throughout 2003 to 2016 that there was a net negative influx of people coming in through the southern border through illegal means in such a way. So we were actually losing people instead of gaining them through immigration. And this has probably changed since about 2016. The caravan situation has drastically increased the number of refugees here, especially when we separate families and we have to keep them here for prolonged periods of time because we can't reunite families and send them back home fast. So right now the numbers are probably a bit skewed, but for almost 12 years we were at a net negative, and no one wants to or is talking about this. It's very interesting to me.
All right, so there's a net negative of immigrants. We don't, of course, like you said, we don't know exactly what the numbers are now, or at least in a 2-year time frame since the immigrant caravan and all this other immigration cases have come about. But I guess the question is, do we have too many immigrants in this country right now? What do you think your answer to that is?
I honestly don't know. Um, I feel as though we're probably starting to reach the tipping point if we haven't already. We are definitely becoming an overpopulated society, especially in the border cities and states. So I don't. Time will tell, especially if this, if we keep getting more and more people here. I'm not sure how these caravan immigrations are going, so I assume our numbers are growing at this point even more.
So I'm hearing kind of a conflicting. Maybe I'm misunderstanding here. So you're saying that there is a net negative of immigrants currently.
I'm saying that there was a net negative from 2003 to 2016, which is where the data ends. We don't have any more data past 2016, 2017
Right.
timeframe
So
that is
now you're saying that.
reliable enough for me to accurately state with confidence.
Right. So now you're saying
But
that.
from the numbers from 2001, the immigration number was at 1,636,000 immigrants from Mexico alone. And at 2007, the number had dropped all the way down to just over 130,000 people. So we have seen a significant decline of people from Mexico, and people are obviously coming in from different countries, but it's at such a negligible amount. Over at the 2003, there was about 12,000 people coming in from non-Mexican countries, and on 2017, it was just over 180,000. So we're still looking at far, far less immigrants in total than we were at 2003, with that over 1.5 million Mexicans coming into our country.
Right. So we have the net negative, um, but we don't know that anymore. Right. That data ends, like you said, at 2016. So you don't know.
Yes.
So you're saying you don't know right now, your opinion at least. You don't know how you feel about the current immigration numbers. Is that
I
fair to say?
assume they're increasing, but I assume that they're still well under that 1.5 million that we were getting in 2003.
Right.
So I
But
feel
I'm
like that
asking if do you think
we're
we
not
have
getting an alarming number.
right? So you're saying that we're not getting too many right now, at least in your opinion. You don't know the full data, but in your opinion, that we're not
Right.
having
Is
a
there already too many immigrants in America? I don't know the answer to that. Are we
right,
getting too many right now? No.
right, and that's my second question, right? Uh, right. Do we have too many immigrants right now? Right, and I think this ties into just the natural discussion about the U.S. population. So we have something about what 300 million to 360 million Americans, right, in this country. What do you think is a realistic number for our population to be? So we have countries like China, for instance, they're close to 2 billion, perhaps even more now. Um, what do you think our realistic or ideal, perhaps, numbers are? How many of those should be immigrants, and how many of those should be natural Americans? Does it matter? Some thoughts on along those lines. What do you think about this?
Sure, that's a great question. I actually, I'm not really sure about the benefits between, state-born citizens or immigrants who become citizens. I really don't think there's a distinction between the value of those people. Um, but as for the limit on the number of people we could have in America as a country, it would probably be around 600 million at the most. I fear that we would reach a tipping point if we had too many people in our country, and
Can
we
you
already see the effects of overpopulation, especially in certain areas. As a society, we probably need to learn to spread out to our Midwestern states here very shortly, because otherwise we're going to run into issues with clean water and stuff like that.
Right, and I agree wholeheartedly that we naturally have these ecological environmental concerns where we as a country have leave the most or the greatest ecological footprints in the world, which is kind of sad considering. But I guess I'm wondering why 600,000. It seems like
600 million, I said.
okay,
So
600
that's
million,
about,
right?
it's a little over double the population we have now. I feel like that's probably a little bit justifiable just based on the fact that we're able to fit the number of people we do now into our basically eastern and western coasts, where the concentration of most Americans are. You have
Right.
Texas as a kind of an outlier, as well as Illinois, Chicago type areas. But there's plenty of area to still spread out in America, and there's plenty of metropolises that are still to grow once people move out to these areas. So I feel like our number can roughly double, a little bit less than double is what I'm giving it, but I feel like that might be pushing even.
Right. I mean, this is all very interesting conversation. It's kind of off topic, but there's been a interesting article where they said that the entire population of humans can fit in Texas. They can live there. It's an interesting thing to talk about. So I'm not really
Yeah, I
sure.
feel like you would
Mhm.
have to change quite a lot to live that way, though, unfortunately.
Right. So I'm not really sure exactly what our limitations as a country is. We certainly can, if China can manage nearly 2 billion people, I'm sure Americans can do that too. I guess the question is at what cost, right? At what cost of quality of life? At what cost of economic issues? And right, these are things that are more or less unknown to us right now. Can we maintain the American standard of living while having uh, more than triple or double our population? And that's an interesting question to ask. And this inevitably ties into the immigration questions, right? Because as more people immigrate to this country, can we accommodate them all and still maintain the standard of life that we have here? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's why I give ourselves that number because I feel like unless there's some kind of dire change or improvement with our scientific knowledge or technological capability, then we're really going to have a life expectancy decrease and quality of life decrease if we just keep overpopulating ourselves past that one number I stated. And that's just an estimate. I'm not an expert on this stuff. I just kind of gave a number that I thought was best. It could very well be less than that. It could be a lot more than that based on the land that we have in America. Um, but, I feel like we're already starting to see the effects of overpopulation here.
Right. What's our next topic?
Well, our next topic kind of ties into technology here, just a slight amount. Um, we're going to discuss what the border agents are talking about, what they're actually requesting to help them versus, you know, we have our commander-in-chief dash president that is making his demands over a border wall, physical barrier. So we're gonna look at all of that in depth right now, and we're gonna first start off about what are the actual experts, what are the agents themselves requesting, what are they asking for, and is that going to get funded? So the first thing that the agents really, really want, and they all say this, is that they need better technology. That means they need motion sensing devices, they need drones, they need different kinds of roads and ways to navigate past the physical barriers that they already have. They need to be able to know exactly where the people are trying to sneak in with these motion sensors so they can send officers out to get them. They need manpower also is what they're asking for. The one thing they're not asking for is a coast-to-coast barrier, which is what Trump is talking about. So what he's saying versus what the agents are saying themselves doesn't really add up here. That's a little bit concerning for people who are following this topic. And as for the cost of what he's talking about, he's asking for $5 billion for this physical barrier concrete wall. He's given up on the concrete thing. Um, in place of steel barriers, but it's still going to be a wall coast to coast according to what he wants. So he's asking for $5 billion. We already spent 1.4 billion on the physical barrier itself back in 2016 with the Secure Fence Act. And that bill was a whopping $50 billion bill that the rest of the money besides that 1.4 for the actual physical barrier fences was all going to maintenance costs and personnel costs and different kinds of other things that would go into the actual cost to have this wall standing for the next 25 years. So that's $50 billion already spent on physical barriers that Trump is now demanding $5 billion more for.
Right, and that is troubling. That is troubling. So what I would personally like to know, I'm not an expert on this issue, but what I personally like to know is what are the realistic costs that we need or that Trump needs to build a wall, right? And how much can we afford to give as a nation to border security? If it's even, is it worth a $5 billion investment? Is it worth all this controversy and division in our country? And these are things that there are no clear-cut answers for. It seems that whether we like it or not, the country is divided on this issue. I personally don't see a need to build a wall if the experts are saying that it's not effective means to deter illegal immigration. But if in the slight chance that it perhaps may, then I'm not opposed to the possibility that it could. So a wall will be fine in that situation too. What I don't understand is that this basically essentially this issue single-handedly has brought the government to a shutdown and a standstill, and that's something. So what are your thoughts on that? Like that's something that's troubling to say the least, is it not?
Oh yes, this has been it's been our longest government shutdown in history. The one before this one was 21 days back in 1995 when Bill Clinton was president. So yeah, this has been the longest shutdown we've had. Many, many millions of people are out of work right now for, as far as I can see it, just people not being able to agree on a solution that's being offered right in front of them. We've got this demand that he's made for $5 billion. Before that, he was demanding more money. He said $25 billion at first. He knew he wasn't going to get that much. He was told as much, so he kept lowering that number until the 5.7 billion to be exact is what he's asking for. So the Democrats have counter-offered him with the $1.3 billion deal. They're offering him physical barriers to complete the Secure Fence Act bill of 2006. That basically covered what you would call as a wall. It's not a wall. What we consider it's not concrete. It is physical barriers that are basically walls. They extend for miles and miles all over the range of our border. There are some gaps in our wall that we have. So there's not really that many areas that need to still have that physical barrier. There are some. So we don't need that much money for that. Trump thinks that we need to just build a massive wall all along our coast. We already have most of the wall that he wants. So the cost can be pretty negligible for the rest of that completion, and we could honestly probably take it out of that $50 billion that we have set aside for the Secure Fence Act.
And that's a very
Even
interesting point. So you're saying that there are some gaps to fill in the fence, but overall that the fence already exists, right? Is that a fair assumption to make?
I would say that probably at least 70% of what Trump wants already exists, yes.
Right. And are those walls actually, or fence, whatever you want to call it, are they actually effective in deterring? Is it essentially just a picket fence where someone can just hop over, or are they real physical barriers that are going to stop people from coming in to the crossing the border.
They are real physical barriers. You're gonna have to climb over these with a ladder or some other kind of climbing equipment. If you fall from them without proper equipment to climb back down, you're going to be injured. Many people have been injured from trying to climb over these things. As to whether they're completely effective, we've already known that they aren't. There was
Right,
actually
right.
just a case recently, I think it was 1 or 2 days ago, as of this podcast, where a group of over 370 people have dug a tunnel under an Arizona barrier that is more than 15 feet high. And they dug a tunnel under it, similar to the way that the Palestinians do over in Israel. And they, tried to sneak onto the other side of this tunnel. Luckily, uh, we were able to see these people coming out of the other side of this tunnel because it was such a large mass of people. But you can imagine if these people were in a more secluded area where they may not have had the officers on duty to see this or the technology to know that they were doing this. And this is why technology is so important. If we had motion sensing, we could have seen these people, committing the acts of starting to dig the tunnel well before they had put in all of this work to be able to sneak all these people through. And this is the kind of things that are really going to be a solution for us, not just to have a bit physical barrier that apparently they will just dig right underneath it if they need to.
Right, and we're really ignoring the human ingenuity here, right? We're not like a pig or some livestock that it's like, well, I see a fence, I can't cross it, I better just stay here, right? They're gonna fly, they're gonna ride boats, they can dig tunnels, they can do whatever, like they can build a ladder, I imagine, right? They can build a
Yeah,
two-way ladder.
people are much smarter than we give them credit for.
Right, I
And,
mean,
the walls may have worked way back in the day when you were fending against a Viking army, but they're not going to work with people who are desperate to cross the other side for their own survival. They're not here to raid us. They are just desperate for their own survival at this point. Whether it's justified or not, it's a different question, but their determination is there.
right, which should bring us to our next topic about the migrant caravans. So if you could introduce to us what you think about the migrant caravans, just give us some logistics. What do you think they're doing? Why are they doing this? Do you think what they're doing is justified? Where do you stand on this issue?
This is a very interesting one, especially the timing of it all, and there's some research to be done to try and consider what is exactly going on, which I hopefully have done adequately. I feel I have. And so you can research all this stuff. There's tons of people, thousands in certain caravans, hundreds of people in other caravans, all trying to come north into America through Mexico. So they are coming from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala mostly. There are very few of them that are actually from Mexico or any other place. Um, And you can look at the history here is a little bit interesting, especially for the Honduras thing. Um, Back in 2009, we were giving them a lot of aid to their police and military force. Granted, tons of American dollars have basically gotten missing in this country. Essentially wasted dollars. We've wasted hundreds of millions of dollars trying to aid a country that is corrupt, and they have politicians who don't care about their population, and they have police force that are corrupt, and they have mayors and governors that are corrupt. But there has been some aid that has finally trickled through to the right causes, and it's such a negligible amount that it probably wasn't even worth doing. And that aid was finally cut in 2016 on the behalf of Congress. There's still more aid going to them. It's not going to the police and military right now. And that is when these caravans started in Honduras, interestingly enough. Is there some connection there between massive corruption between their police force and finally people saying enough is enough and fleeing? That's something to consider. However, they're still getting massive amounts of American dollars in terms of support for their own government. Um, they just got $181 million in 2017. So the fact that we cut this one area of aid doesn't seem to be justifiable in the amount of people fleeing here. That's all very strange to me, to be honest. There obviously is atrocities happening to these people. Some of it did come from our CIA long ago in the 80s. Is it all justified? I don't think it is at this point. It was a long time ago. We're paying for it, and we have been paying for it. I don't know when enough is enough at this point.
Right, and I think that's the key point of discussion here. So, granted that we have some history of policing or otherwise running a colony in Central America, there has to be some blowback that comes from this, and there has been. So we're seeing this now with the caravan coming in here. The question is, of course, like you said, how much are we really responsible for? Are we responsible for the entire corruption of the Central American governments? Where has all this billions of dollars that we've been investing in have gone? What where's the infrastructure? Where is the progress? If you go back 60 years or 40 years and look at Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador of today and compare it to those in the past, what do we have to show for our you want to call it reparations, you want to call it investment, you want to call it foreign aid, whatever you want to call it, what have we to show for that? And really, all we have to show for it are these American caravans, right? And that's a very depressing fact that we have to deal with. So now this is something that I don't like about the American caravan. So I don't know how widespread this notion is, but well, we know that Mexico has at first offered to take in all the migrant caravans. They said we'll offer them jobs, citizenship, whatever, give them asylum. A vast majority, however, rejected that offer and said we're going to America. And so they did. And then they go to the border. Well, at first they break down the Mexican border by throwing rocks. They have a riot basically, and they get through somehow. And then they go to the American border and they start demanding. They say we want $50,000 each, and then we'll go back to our country. Does this sound like an asylum seeker? Does this sound like a refugee? No, it doesn't sound like that to me. This sounds like these people are just people that want a handout, and that's what's really I have a problem with in regards to this immigration issue or the caravan issue, I should say. I don't think immigrants from the Middle East, Asia, or even most Central or South American countries are asking for $50,000 when they first come to the country, right? They're not saying, "Well, I want to come live in your country, but give me $50,000, and I'll go back home." Like this is not the attitude that we want from people that want to come to America. And I don't know where this sense of entitlement came from. Maybe it came from this, like you said, the CIA and all these historical. I'm not really familiar with the history of that, but even if we had that history and that blowback coming to haunt us, essentially, that's the wrong mind state. I don't feel like people should come here and just start demanding money, kind of like blackmailing us or trying to send us to a guilt trip into earning some money so they can, it just doesn't seem genuine to me. It just seems more like, people are out to get handouts and free. What do you think about this?
I mean, obviously, you've basically summed it up right there. For certain people, if they're asking for money basically to extort America and then to go home afterward after they've gotten what they wanted, that's not an asylum seeker. I mean, no one will say they are unless they're insane. There obviously are people who are, genuine refugees that are in these caravans. Maybe it's not all of them. It may not even be the majority of these people. Some people are coming from, terrible situations where they feel like they are not going to be able to live next week unless they do something about it and they have to flee. But I feel like that's probably few and far between, to be honest. And I think that that's kind of what we're finding out here with these people. If they're making demands like that, obviously, that's just abhorrent. And to have these people abuse this way of coming to America, they're basically hurting the people who are in need. And that's the worst part about it, because they're making it so much harder for people who are actually a justified refugee to come into America and seek the asylum that they're requesting. When you have this mass influx of people who are basically, like you said, entitled people that feel like they are just need to come to America and that's just their God-given right, which it's not, unfortunately, for them. Um, yeah, that's a crime to humanity, unfortunately.
So, what are your thoughts on the methods of entry to the states? So there have been obviously the tunnel builders, and there's people that are just turning the fence with stones and using children and women as shields, and there are also people that are just waiting patiently in Tijuana and wherever. Uh, what do you think is the most appropriate way to seek asylum? Has this unfortunately gone for the worse, and now there is essentially is no proper way to seek for asylum, unfortunately, because of all the controversy? Uh, what about those people that rejected asylum in Mexico, which is, unfortunately a majority of people? What do you have to say to all these seekers and refugees in their various situations and their methods of entry?
Well, obviously, I think the best way to apply for asylum is legally. Our legal system obviously does need work. It probably needs more funding. It probably needs more employees. It definitely needs some kind of reform. There's a lot of people who spend years and years waiting to get citizenship, and that's why it's so appealing to just come in illegally and say, screw the legal means here. I just want in as fast as possible, because these people don't want to wait. Sometimes they don't have the time to wait for these processes to take over. We really need to reform our system on that. No one's talking about that. The Democrats aren't talking about that. The Republicans aren't talking about that. That is a huge problem in our society that we need to fix, and the only way it's going to get fixed is if people are talking about it. So that's something clearly that needs work. As for people who aren't getting asylum in Mexico and it's offered to them, is asylum in Mexico really going to be what it could be in America? No. If you're offered asylum in Mexico and you have the opportunity to come into America, you're going to choose America. Any logical person would. Is it justified for people to turn down the asylum in Mexico when they don't have another option? I honestly don't know. I don't know if they feel that Mexico is just as dangerous as where they come from. There's some argument to be made for the case that it might be. I don't feel like that's probably going to be the case, to be honest. Mexico seems like it's genuinely trying to help these people out. It is not as dangerous as a lot of the places that these people are coming from. So maybe they just want the best of the options that they have, and they want to come to America, so they turn Mexico down. Seems a little bit foolish in my opinion, but I can see the logic behind it. There's one more thing that I would like to add before we move on, though, about the American problem with all this stuff. I mean, it's hard to not acknowledge that all these problems are coming, not 100%, maybe not even 60 or 50%, but there is some problem with the amount of American money and dollars that are going from our drug addicts and people who aren't even drug addicts but that enjoy drugs and they buy these drugs from people who are importing them from Mexico and other South and Central American countries. And these drug lords and these gangs and these cartels end up getting very powerful, and they have a lot of hold over certain territories and even governments in certain countries. It's not that bad in Honduras with the government corruption in terms of gangs owning the government. So there is heinous government corruption just on the fact that these people keep the dollars that we give them on top of their gangs interfering with people living their day-to-day lives. So it's American caused in some way at least, and Americans do not like talking about that. If we legalized our drugs, that we would see a significant decline in people seeking refugee. In my opinion, we would have to sort our own business out, but we wouldn't be messing other people up in the process, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the drug money, and it's a question of indirect American responsibility for the problems in Central and South America. And I think that's a good point to make, but we have to ask ourselves: is the answer really to legalize all drugs? As much about as I am a proponent of uh, free will and personal liberties, I'm hesitant to blame squarely the problems of Central America on Americans buying drugs from them. Is that a is that a
Oh, I
fair
totally
argument?
agree.
Yeah.
That's what I said. I'm not sure it's even 60 or 50% of the problem that they have there. We can't deny that it is a problem, and it's causing some percentage of the problem that they're facing there in that country. Is it a whopping majority of why they're suffering these issues? That is a something we'll have to find out, I guess, if we ever fulfill what I believe would be a good solution.
Right. And what do
Um,
you think will be a good solution for these corrupted governments we have? So obviously, throwing money at the problem isn't a good solution, and
oh
neither
no.
is this opinion that people seem to have that it's a bit unfair in my opinion. So we have this population of people that think, well, oh, if your country is so shitty, if your country is so terrible, why don't you go and fight and make it better, like we did against the British during the Revolutionary War? Why don't you fight for your prosperity and freedom and human rights? And I think this is rather an unfair criticism of only because have any of us really fought? Have any of us really had to rebel against the government? I mean, we haven't made that sacrifice. Our ancestors did. Our ancestors made that sacrifice, and we enjoy it freely without any interest. And now to ask these people to do it as if we have already done it ourselves, when it was really our ancestors that have spilled blood, right, and have killed men to earn that unearn this freedom. To ask that of these people, it seems a bit, if not cruel or harsh, it just seems a bit arrogant and assuming. Was that be presumptuous me to assume? What are your thoughts on this?
I think that that's basically how I feel about it as well. I mean, it's hard to tell someone to do something that would cost their own life when you're not willing to do the same, and or you haven't had to even face the situation where it would require you to even contemplate having to do that uh, or make that sacrifice. I mean, we've had this problem in this American society, I feel, for a while, going back to the Vietnam War, really, with a lot of people, fighting against being drafted in every way they possibly could. They all went to college to get the deferments, and we all have found out that the deferments for draft uh, applicants and stuff like that drastically rose during the Vietnam War through college deferments, and it ended up in causing the inequality with people being drafted. It caused poor people to be drafted instead of the middle class that were able to afford to go to college. And so you have a generation of people that basically dodged the draft, and then they started harking on younger generations about their patriotism when they themselves were draft dodgers. It's been a problem in America ever since then. We had a good generation that was willing to fight for what was needed, and our generations after that have tried to every way they can to avoid fighting.
Right, and this is basically highlighting just the modern American's hypocrisy, or the modern person's hypocrisy, really. And I think that's something to something that's relevant for everyone to think about before they demand, these refugees to go fight for their country. Go fight for your country. It's easy to say from your armchair, but right now to say, well, if we really care, if we're really compassionate, if we're really one family of humanity, then we should equally care and we should equally take arms and fight for our fellow humans' rights and freedoms. But we don't do that.
There's a great point. There's a
We
great point there.
we sit back and we criticize and say, well, they should fight for it while I sit here and enjoy my freedoms and liberty that my ancestors have earned. And it's really hypocritical. It's really I'm not saying that we should go and bear arms and fight for all these people. I'm not volunteering anybody. I'm not volunteering myself even. It's just that these people that make these claims, it just seems a bit disingenuous, if not just downright hypocritical. But I think we're getting a little off tangent here. So what's our next topic here to move on to?
The next one, and this is going to be our last topic of the night, is whether the number of criminals that are coming in to America through the immigration illegally is actually a problem for us or not.
Right, and
And
that's very interesting.
as far as I understand, you're going to always have people who are what I would call, outliers in our society, or outliers in any society, really. There's going to be deviants that are going to commit crime. And we have these people in America at a very high rate. It's actually significantly higher than the amount of people that are immigrants that end up committing crime. Natural-born citizens are far more likely to be criminals than people who immigrate here. So as far as I'm concerned, the criminal aspect for the immigrants, yes, there are immigrants who are going to be criminals. This is a situation that is not unique to any group or culture or subspecies or any kind of dynamic you can imagine for the human race. We're all going to have the people who are deviants from what we deem as society for ourselves. And there's always going to be a slim minority of people who will commit heinous acts that we deem as illegal. But these are very minute, and they're not really even worth mentioning in terms of people seeking refugees.
Yeah, I think this wraps up nicely to our first point, or one of our earlier points where we were saying not all refugees are rapists. Not all refugees are committing crimes, right? Like we said, there's a point where we have a population of people from a different culture that's impoverished or otherwise perhaps doesn't respect the social standing of women in the Western world, and these things all conflict. So you don't have the same educational standards. You don't have the same cultural sensitivities as the Westerners do. And there's going to be natural conflicts that happen. And I'm not saying that these refugees are intrinsically worse people or incapable of assimilating. It's just that, like we said, there has to be a better program to assimilate them. It can't just be, well, now you're here, it's up to you to assimilate. That can't be the answer to criminals or crime that takes place, rather. And if there are criminals, then we have to, of course, take a firm stance against that. One of the things I don't like that I've seen is that there are a lot of these. Uh, I don't want to say left wing, but it's kind of is like a left wing issue where there are these Germany or Sweden, wherever you wanna point to, they tend to hush down refugee crimes, and it's really not doing anybody any favors. It's not being progressive, despite what they might think. Let's be honest; these things happen, and let's tackle them honestly. Let's tackle them with a real solution in mind, and not just try to hush it up and say, well, frankly, it's insulting. It's saying that, well, these refugees are just, they're just third world ignorant people. They can't be held accountable for their actions. No, they're people. They should have known better, and they should respect the laws. Nowhere in the world is rape legal, I think, right? I mean, it might not be enforced as strictly, certainly, but nowhere is it really legal and, smiled upon, right? This is frowned upon universally. It's not a good thing to do. Just anybody with a sense of sympathy will know that that's not a thing that you should do. And to kind of hush it up and say that, buried under this, this agenda of taking care of the refugees is insulting to refugees, in a lot of ways. And we need to just act, if you really want to make a progressive and meaningful change, we should first be honest about the problem that's happening, acknowledge it, and find real solutions to it instead of trying to, hush it down and cover it up or try to justify it, which is insulting to everyone.
I totally agree. I mean, I will say that before we move on exactly, but there are some countries that will allow for marital rape, quote unquote. They don't consider it rape if you have forced relations with your marriage partner, but um, our
Clearly not what's
society.
happening, right? Clearly not what's happening with the refugees. They're not married to these,
It's not,
right, to the
yeah,
locals,
it's
right?
not the same as just meeting someone on the street and then having your way with them, of course. But just to make that distinction before we carry on. So obviously these people are, they're committing, things against women. I was stated earlier, men are grabbing women in Germany and things like that. They're doing worse. They're committing rape sometimes. It's not going reported. It seems like the liberals are trying to like keep this under hush, as you said. They don't want this like inevitable secret that everyone already knows to escape from the ether that they seem to think they are holding close to their chest. We all saw this coming, really, when you have people that believe in Sharia law moving into a first world country without the guidance. This is why I love the Canadian system so much. I'm going to keep talking about it if I need to, where they have these families that raise people literally to live in their society. It's the best system I've ever heard of. It limits the amount of people that can come into your country just on a natural basis, on the goodness of your own country's heart, essentially. And you've got these families that are willing to guide these people, teach them every aspect of a culture that they're going to live into and assimilate. And they are going to, learn that you can't just grab a woman when you see her and that she's attractive and that you want her. You're going to learn the way to speak to people when you greet them in the grocery store or on the street. You have to have this kind of guidance or, a parent in a way to show you the way that society in this way or in our side of the world works. You can't just walk into it and be expected to live the way that the rest of us live. It's not realistic. You're gonna need someone to teach you how. It's a little bit different with people coming from South America. They're not coming from a completely different culture than the people that are coming from Sharia law are, but granted, they still are coming from a different culture. They're gonna need a little bit of guidance at least. And if you're not willing to give it to them, then bad things are gonna happen inevitably. And we found that out all over the world, all throughout history.
All right, and I'll just like to add that I'm sure you're not saying, and I'm necessarily not saying that everyone that is a Muslim or prescribed to Sharia law is a rapist, or think that they can just grab any woman off the street, right? Uh,
Of course,
right.
people
So,
sometimes move here and they realize just from the way that other people act that, they know that certain ways aren't appropriate to act anymore. Other people just need a little bit more guidance, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're not evil. They just need a little bit of help to just show them how to live in our society,
but
and we need to be willing to provide that for them.
I'm saying also that I don't think they live that way in the Middle East. Even I don't think they go around raping women off the streets, right? Hopefully, I'm almost positive they don't do that. But I think there's something to be said about. So that's why the hijab is, or the hajib, or uh, the garments, right, that covers their
Oh,
uh,
of course. Yeah, there's
th-
something to be said. I mean, they move into Germany, they see these women dressing the way that they do in
right,
comparison to what they exposed to back at home.
and
They need
it's a different
to
ball game for
they
them,
need
right?
to be taught all this stuff, You can't just see this beautiful woman showing her legs and her boobs are hanging out of her shirt, basically,
And then
the
just
way that we
thinks
dress in Western culture.
right, and just thinks she's a slut
That's
and
a
she's up for it, right?
natural
Right.
that's a natural indicator to someone from, most human societies that they're ready for it, and in our society that doesn't mean that. And
Right.
it's very confusing for people to just see this when they're used to seeing women in the hijab, like you said. We need to have people, show them the way. That's very important to do.
Right. So I just want to make the decision clear. We're not saying that all Muslims are rapists, in the Middle East or wherever. We're just saying that there is a cultural difference here, right? That naturally has to be taken into account. We can't ignore it. The facts are out there. We're not making these stories up, right? The facts are out there. We have to acknowledge these things are happening, and I think I completely agree. We need something interactive, something personal, something to really make them feel a part of the society that they're being brought into. Not just saying, "Well, welcome. Here's some money. Here's a house. Do with it what you will." Right? And that's not a progressive way to think about it. That's not a meaningful interaction with people that you want them to be a part of your society, your neighbors, or whatever you want to call it, community. And I think the best way is, like you said, just has to be more personal and interactive, like the Canadians are apparently doing.
And the Canadian system isn't flawless, but it is just the best I've heard of. I really think that it would do more justice for people to consider at least. So I think we had a great discussion for our first podcast, and we hope you all enjoyed it. And we hope that you will be tuning in next week for our next discussion. We will have that topic maybe posted online before we actually do the podcast. We got some couple ideas mulling of which topic we're going to cover next. But thank you very much. Signing out now.
Yep. Thanks for listening.